Blog Talk Radio.
Okay, y'all, let's get started. This one is, this message today is about God's righteousness or our righteousness. Many of us think that we can do it better than God did. And all we do is find ourselves getting caught up in trouble. And I'm going to explain to you why I'm doing this message. I've done several videos on YouTube about Africa and some of the things that take place in Africa. I'll give you a couple of incidents. One, two men in Africa, in Kenya, this happened not too long ago, had stolen some potatoes, food. And it was an unjust act, stealing. So what the townspeople thought would be a righteous act was to take them and beat them senseless, then pour gasoline on them, and then burn them alive. You could actually see one of the men crawling around as he burned alive to his death. That was their form of righteousness, and they think themselves justified in doing that. People just stood by and watched, didn't even lift a finger. That's their form of righteousness. Another incident, they performed what they call, the term is female mutilation, is where they circumcise women in Africa. A lot of people don't know what that came out of. But what it was born out of was men saying, okay, I don't want my wives, plural, to mess around and cheat. So we're going to cut off the clitoris of the female so that they cannot derive any pleasurable sensation during the act of sex. This will keep them in line, keep them from cheating. Because cheating is an unrighteous act, right? So they thought that to keep them from doing an unjust act, they would do this just act, their justice, their righteousness. They would perform this righteous act upon the women to keep them in line. So I've just given you a couple of examples where we see an unrighteous act and then man stepping in and engaging what they call a righteous act. So I say to you, whose righteousness do we want? Do we want the righteousness of man to guide us, or do we want the righteousness of God? Because, see, when we let the righteousness of man lead us, it only brings us trouble. And I'm going to give you some examples of how. But before I do that, one thing Jesus said when the men they caught a woman supposedly engaged in adultery with a man. And they brought her to him, and they say, don't the law say, we're supposed to stone this woman to death? So Jesus said, okay, now they done caught her in an unrighteous act. Now he's not saying what she did was okay. But they brought her about to stone her to death. Now, this is what they think is their righteous act for the unrighteous act of the woman. But hold up. One person can't commit adultery by themselves, can they? Where was the man? But Jesus didn't even have to bring that up to him. He said, okay, y'all want to stone this woman to death? He among you that is without sin, let him cast the first stone. They just started dropping their rocks and they walked off. Because he showed them the true nature of their supposed righteous act, which was to stone this woman to death. Our righteousness only serves to get us in more trouble when we try to do what we think is right as opposed to doing what God has already told us is right. So let me give you some examples of how we get here. One of the first ones was the Tower of Babel. And this is in Genesis 4:9. You can read about it there. And they said, go to, let us build a city and a tower, whose top may reach unto heaven, and let us make a name, lest we be scattered abroad upon the face of the whole earth. Now here is men not satisfied with what God has already provided them. They decide we want to build us a tower that will stretch into heaven. Again, man trying to be like God with his mess. Just like when Eve was beguiled by Satan, Satan said, hey, you want to be just like God? Eat of this tree. That's why God don't want you to eat this fruit, because he don't want you to be like him. But if you eat this, you'll be just like God. Man seeking his own righteousness as opposed to the righteousness of God. We will make us a tower that will reach into heaven. And the Lord came down to see the city and the tower, which the children of men. And the Lord God, and the Lord said, behold, the people is one. They have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. So what God is saying, they got this one language, and now they've decided we're going to determine our own righteousness. We're going to build us a tower that will go to heaven. And so what I keep trying to tell folks, don't call me the man of God. I can't go to God's level. The only thing that's possible in this scenario or the relationship between man and God is for God to come to man's level. That's why Christ referred to himself as the Son of Man. Notice, the Son of Man. God came to our level. Y'all can't come to my level. The only thing we can hope to do is emulate God's righteousness, to follow God's righteousness. But we got to leave ours out. So, verse 7, go to, let us go down, and now this is God. Go to, let us go down. It is God, let us go down. Because man's trying to come up to God, okay? But God, he already know they can't do this. But they will get high and mighty in their mind, and they'll think that they are God. Okay? God said, go to, let us go down and confound their language, that they may not understand one another's speech. So he's about to divide and conquer. So the Lord scattered them abroad and thence upon the face of all the earth, and they left off to build the city. They gave that up. Because God showed them the error in their ways. Therefore is the name it is called Babel, because the Lord did confound their language of all the earth, and from thence did the Lord scatter them abroad upon the face of all the earth. One example of man trying to go to God's level, his righteousness, as opposed to God's righteousness. We get ourselves in trouble. Matthew 19:5 and 6. Here's another example. And said, for this cause shall man leave father and mother, and shall cleave unto his wife, and they twain shall be one flesh. Wherefore they are no more twain, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let not man put asunder. Well, okay, what's the problem with that, minister? The problem with that is man in his own righteousness decided to add a twist to let no man put asunder that which God has joined together. Man got his own twist he want to add on it. And here comes the twist. Mark 10, verse 4 and 5. And they said, they speaking to Jesus, Moses suffered to write a bill of divorcement and to put her away. In other words, Moses allowed us to divorce our wives, and put her away. And Jesus answered and said unto them, for the hardness of your heart, he didn't say God. He didn't say God. He said, he wrote you this precept. But in the beginning, it was not so. So here again, Jesus is telling them that's something man wanted to do. Divorce is not a part of God's righteousness. He plainly said, that which God has joined together. Now, am I saying that divorce for the whole world is not, that's not what I'm saying. I'm talking about those marriages that are put together by God. So I ain't talking about if you get together and go marry Joe Blow off the street. You know, what y'all are a part of the world. If you decide to do something like that, you put yourself in the world and you are subject to what the world has to offer. God said, be ye separate from the world. Be transformed. So marriages that God put together, divorce wasn't a part of it, but man in his own righteousness, again, trying to be like God, Jesus straightened them out. Moses wrote that precept. That wasn't God. Let's not get it twisted. Moving right along, 1 Timothy 3 and 2. A bishop then must be blameless, the husband of one wife, vigilant, sober, and of good behavior, given to hospitality, apt to teach. Did y'all see that part where it says the husband of one wife? Now this is Paul telling a man who wants to teach the word of God, lead the people in God's righteousness, not the man's righteousness. But do y'all remember David, Saul, Jacob? They all had multiple wives and concubines. But that wasn't God. That's what man did. And this is what a lot of people don't understand, and this is why we still get caught up today. What was the trouble with Abraham and Sarah and Hagar, one of his concubines, his handmaiden that he was having sexual relationships with? They ended up with a child, and ultimately he ended up sending them off into the desert, trying to do it their way, man's way. That was Sarah's idea. Rather than trusting in God's righteousness and waiting for Sarah to bear his child. What happened with Moses? Married one woman, got tricked, worked for her for 7 years, then had to work for the man another 7 years to get the wife that he really wanted. Man's righteousness. Look at what happened with David. Sent a man to the front line to be killed so he can get his woman. Ended up bearing a son that tried to kill him. So when men put in what they think is their righteousness, it don't bring nothing but trouble. So all this polygamy, this female circumcision, divorce, all of that is nothing but man's mess. Ain't got nothing to do with God. But we twist that, and we try and call it, this is what God would have us to do. This is righteous in the eyes of God. The word says our best is as filthy rags. That includes what we think. He said, our best is as filthy rags. Our righteousness is as filthy rags to the Lord. He ain't interested in our righteousness. He is only interested in his righteousness. But we think doing it our way and under the guise of God makes it okay. This is why so many people get twisted up in churches today, listening to man's form of righteousness and not God's form of righteousness. That's how we end up where we are. Moving on to Islam, the Jews, and Christ. All three of these forms of religion serve the same God, Allah. All three of these forms of religion has as their historical text the Old Testament. But what is the major difference in these three religions that serve that supposedly serve the same God. I'll tell you what the difference is. The Jews rejected Christ. Why? Because they expected Christ to come back kicking some behind, to overthrow Rome, the oppressor. That ain't why Christ came down here. Christ came down here to show people you need to be living according to God's will, God's righteousness. The Jews could never understand why they went into captivity in the first place. They didn't like the rule of Moses. They didn't like the rule of the judges. They didn't like the king. But it was the kings that took them into captivity. The kings trying to do it their way, with their wickedness. Doing it their way. Islam, and they've added all kind of stuff on top of God's righteousness. Calling it right. How in the world can you think it is God's will for somebody to strap a bomb across their chest and walk into a room full of crowded people and blow somebody up and they say, this is what God would have me to do. Now I'm going to heaven and I'm going to have 70 virgins. Man's mess. Christ came down here to show us his way. He came down to man's level and said, you got to do this God's way, not your way. Because when you do it your way, all you do is mess up. But see, here's what I really need y'all to grab out of what I just said. When you come up with your way and you say, this is what God would have, you are mistaken. Your way is not what God is interested in. God is only interested in one way. His. God is only interested in one righteousness. His. He don't care about your righteousness. If you can't conform to what God has for you, don't think you doing him any favor. The only people you are fooling are yourself and the knuckleheads that follow you. Because if you want to understand God's righteousness, all you got to do is read the Bible. Just because David had multiple wives and concubines don't mean that it was of God. Don't mean that. Just because the preacher down the street divorced his wife because she went out and cheated don't mean that that was God's righteousness. That's man's doing. Christ made it plain. That which God has joined together, let no man put asunder. That's man's righteousness. So learn to identify whose righteousness it really is that you are trying to follow. If you can do that, you can keep yourself out of trouble. And that is the end of that.